the grand final itself.
So, Mr. Speaker, for a little while now, individual Aboriginal communities have had some degree of autonomy amongst themselves. Why has there continued to be an exodus from those communities to cities? It's because people who live in poverty are more concerned about their poverty than their abstract rights. It's because it's really, really easy for everyone in this debate to say how great it is that we have the political ideals of autonomy and democracy when we're not worried about where our kids' next meal is coming from. That's what these guys condemn the Aboriginal people to in this debate. The same failure that had occurred in Nunavut and in Canada. The same failure that had occurred in these autonomous communities. These guys wanted to promise these people both freedom and bread. They ended up giving them neither. This debate's come down to two issues. First, the relative value of autonomy and how these guys never meaningfully achieved it for either groups or individuals. And second, why their model will systematically fuck over the Aboriginal people like they've never been fucked over before. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these guys wanted to say that autonomy was the only way to compensate individual Aboriginal Australians. We agreed that we had a duty to compensate these Australians. We had a duty to get rid of the diseases that white man had introduced. We had a duty to get rid of the poverty that we had introduced when we stole their land. And we had a duty to restore their quality of life. This is what the Aboriginal people were actually clamouring out for. So this debate ultimately had to become a debate about which side was instrumentally better placed to restore that quality of life. But what these guys wanted to do instead was appeal to some very abstract principles that actual Aboriginal people, in engaging in mass exoduses from these minor autonomous communities, have shown that they don't value as much as feeding their children. They wanted to say that it's bad when a society tells another society what is good for them, in some instrumental way. That relied on the idea that in order to improve Aboriginal society, you need access to some special knowledge. Here are some actual ways that we can improve Aboriginal society. 1, we can solve poverty by pumping money in. 2, we can solve the problems of homelessness and alcohol using the same sociological solutions that we try to apply in every society. These are symptoms of human societies, not Aboriginals themselves. The one area where their autonomy did slightly start to come into play was the idea of initiation and tribal law. What we did was dispute that that was necessarily good. We pointed to some aspects of tribal law that many people would find unjust, like, for example, certain kinds of corporal punishment. But moreover, we told you why individuals wouldn't necessarily be able to consent to things like the initiation rituals that they wanted to talk about, because they were children, because there was a cultural pressure on those people to be a real Aboriginal. How do I switch this off? This is confounding. That would explain it. Apologies, guys.
Hold on, 1 second. Everyone together, start, timers now.
What were you at?
I have no clue. Legendary. So, we told you how individuals couldn't necessarily consent to either this tribal law or living in the Northern Territory, because they had lost their place in mainstream Australian society when they were now told, here is a special place for you, we don't need to worry about your issues anymore. When they had lost their claim to native title in the rest of Australia, which, by the way, was really, really important to a lot of these Aboriginal people, given that their wild migration patterns that these guys wanted to allege probably didn't take them from one side of the country to the other. They had a specific connection to maybe a large parcel of land, but it was a parcel of land with a specific location, not just an arbitrary chunk of desert in northern Australia. But moreover, they had lost their chance to determine their individual identity as someone who wasn't necessarily completely part of this Aboriginal community, but who wasn't necessarily completely comfortable with identifying as white either. We removed individual autonomy. But what these guys also did was never grant meaningful autonomy to Aboriginal people as a community. That was because when they were talking about federal aid, which we thought was rather dubious, but I'll get to that, it was always the white government's money. And it was always money that was going to be tied and conditional, that the white government could cut off when it so suited. And their institutions weren't meaningfully autonomous either. When Daniel and Michael finally admitted that in order to set them up, they would have to import huge numbers of people from mainstream Australia. What this was in comparison to was to a less racist Australia that was existing, that had native title, that had an Indigenous MP as a real voice for Indigenous Australians, and a society that increasingly cared, that they also wanted to say was racist when it suited them, but wasn't racist when it was feeding these countries, when it was feeding the new community huge amounts of aid. Their one piece of evidence for ours being a racist country was that people voted to support the intervention. 1, John Howard lost. 2, this was about money. And we think, in these circumstances, money comes before bread. Sorry, money comes before freedom. That's what the Aboriginal people had meaningfully chosen. The second issue of tonight's debate was why this new nation will always be terrible, poverty-ridden, and generally awful. We pointed you to the example of Nunavut in Canada, where a country meaningfully tried this, where Year 12 children read at the standard of Year 7 children in the rest of Canada. That was something we pointed to at both speakers. None of these guys wanted to acknowledge it. Why? Because they knew the same structural reasons would lead to their new country being an abstract failure. Because it was a rural desert without much resources or economic development. Because it had people in poverty who you couldn't just tax to raise more money. And because the settlers from the rest of the country had left behind jobs and job prospects, so they couldn't be relied upon for money either. That was why these guys had to admit that this new government needed masses and masses of federal aid. Why would this aid never meaningfully be forthcoming? These guys were all too keen to say that our country was a racist one when it came to Australia at the moment. For some reason, consciously separating yourself from the rest of Australia would make Australia at large less racist. We told you why this federal aid would never be meaningfully forthcoming. 1, because right-wing political groups would always use it as a race-baiting issue. Now it's not just welfare in general, it is the specific massive chunk of money that is going to a foreign country. 2nd, because it'll be off the agenda for Australia, when the media aren't reporting on it, when politicians are able to say, oh, but that's their problem, guys, I'm not personally responsible for it. These guys never meaningfully addressed the idea of the racist society that they sometimes wanted to champion. But what they said was, oh no, there are still huge incentives for aid. We give aid to different countries all the time. First, this was like patently countermanding your idea of Australia as hating all foreigners. 2nd, this was less likely to happen with a group of people who have actively rejected the Australian identity, as opposed to a group of people who just happen to be chilling on a group of nearby islands. They wanted to say, oh, but international bodies will force us to take care of Indigenous Australians. Right, because that's worked so well in the past, guys. Like, when the UNHCR has constantly said, your abuse of Aboriginal Australians is a human rights crisis, the government has never done anything about it. It'll be easier for them to do nothing about it when Aboriginals don't vote them in. 2nd, there'll be a massive backlash in Australia when foreign powers try to impose that on us. And 3rd, like, white people in New York fighting for your rights isn't the kind of meaningful autonomy that you guys wanted to champion. The second reason why this state would fail was the lack of institutional knowledge that Michael finally admitted that they would have to try and import from the rest of Australia. DFAS's excuse for this lack of institutional knowledge would be, well, this government structure wouldn't be like ours, guys. We wouldn't need to import Australia's kind of experts. 1, societies are broadly pretty much similar, right? Like, there are only so many ways you can run hospitals and police. Every society needs those things. Every society will require them. But 2nd, it's very unlikely that these Aboriginal Australians can suddenly set up a radically different form of government when the one that they have lived under their entire lives is the Western government. You can't just turn back the clock 200 years before these people were born. The third reason why this society would fail was that there were no ties that bound these people individually to that society. That was material that Sarah brought you. The only response we got from these guys was, well, all these Aboriginal Australians are oppressed as just one people. Firstly, we would say that the key to their identity as Aboriginals is their past history, which is when they weren't just one group of oppressed Aboriginal people. It was when they were individual tribes. You can't just homogenise them like that. But second, right, there were radically different forms of oppression for those individual people. And these guys finally just threw under the bus individual Aboriginal Australians who wanted chunks of the land that was meaningful to them. Ladies and gentlemen, these guys promised Aboriginal Australians both autonomy and bread. They gave them neither. We at least tried to lift them out of poverty.
The panel were unanimous both in agreeing that the debate was of an excellent quality and was particularly close, and were unanimous in the result. Obviously, both teams were from the University of Sydney Union, so I'm just going to announce the side of the debate that won. It was the affirmative side. The University of Sydney won Champions of Easters 2013. I would also like first to invite up onto stage the runners-up of this tournament, the University of Sydney Union Team 3, to receive their runners-up prizes. And now please join me in one more time congratulating the champions of Easter's Griffith Gold Coast 2013, the team from the University of Sydney Union won.
Cool handshake.
Discussion, debate, democracy. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel. Challenges, innovations, solutions. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel.